General Dan Christman, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Andrew. Good to be with you virtually, if not in person. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Well, you've been a board member here at the American Security Project since our founding. And we wanted to have you on today to talk about civil military affairs, the role of the military in politics, and really talk about this question of the role of the military in American society. Because of recent events in Lafayette Square and elsewhere with the protests, I really couldn't think of anybody better to come and talk about these issues.
I appreciate that, Andrew. Thanks very much. I'm anxious to share some views with you.
So, your last post was as superintendent at West Point, right? And so this is something that I'm sure came up a lot when you're educating cadets, educating the next generation of American military leaders. What do you believe the role of the military is in today's society, and what did you and everybody who worked with you try to inculcate with those cadets as they were, learning how to lead, learning how to play a role as military officers?
Sure, Andrew. Well, I think the easiest way to phrase it is that the military's role in today's society is the same that it was in late 18th century society, and that's to execute the national security policies of the United States, which is typically, over these last 240 years or so, typically directed at foreign adversaries. It's not to help resolve or quell domestic disturbances. And that's the purpose of a U.S. armed force, to confront those foreign adversaries, if necessary, with strong and decisive military force. And at West Point, we give the cadets the context of that history. And most importantly, the context in terms of the effects here of the Lafayette Square disturbances of the last several weeks is the commissioning oath. It's an oath that says, I, the undersigned, support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And what's so unique about that oath for America and for armies, for armed forces of Western societies, is that it's not an oath on behalf of a person or of a party, but it's to the Constitution. And it's that important element of the commissioning oath that sort of drives what West Point has been doing since its founding in 1802, and it's certainly no less relevant today.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That in the past, prior to the founding of America in 1776, the oaths were to the king, or the oaths were to even the general. You think back and to the founders, and they had all read Plutarch, right? And they had all thought about how democracies end, and look through at the examples of Caesar and the military leaders who brought about the end of the Roman Republic, and they had those sorts of things at the top of mind. So I think it's really important that the American military is pledged, as you say, to the Constitution, an idea, a piece of paper, which is pretty remarkable, honestly.
Exactly, and I think to the great credit of the founders, it was to George Washington that we constantly turn at the military academy. There's this large equestrian statue in front of Washington Hall, appropriately positioned, because Washington was in so many respects the founder of the academy. He kept writing Congress and actually kept writing Alexander Hamilton until literally 3 days before Washington died. And was talking about the importance of the establishment of a military academy upon a respectable and extensive basis. And he writes this, hoping that Congress would act, that Hamilton would be able to leverage the influence of Washington, and it failed. It was Thomas Jefferson, actually, that ironically, that said, no, this is unconstitutional, and we're all worried about establishing these military aristocracies. But it was Jefferson ultimately in 1802 that said, I think Washington was right, and signed the charter. But I think what's incredible about the Washington story is that, he wanted to stay at Mount Vernon, as you well know, after the Revolution. He was, essentially drafted by the convention to come and preside, to be the president of the Constitutional Convention.
Mm-hmm.
And what it did in Article 2, Section 2, to establish the office of the presidency, was to name the president the commander-in-chief. And, you just like to think in mind, they had George Washington, this person who personified the apolitical leader of the armed forces of a democracy, then of an army and a navy of a democracy. And so we turn at West Point today. I mean, we continually turn to the story of George Washington and this wonderful path that the convention traversed to name him the president and to craft the Constitution in the vision, in the personification in many respects of Washington as the commander.
And Washington was very self-aware that him as the supreme commander of military forces during the Revolutionary War must remain subordinate to the civil commanders. It must remain subordinate to Congress. Even, you read his letters and he's complaining about Congress all the time. They don't give him the food and the provisions that he needs for the army. But he always was aware that as a democracy, he wasn't the boss. It was the people who were the boss and their elected representatives. And I think that's so important. And as you say, he presided over the Constitutional Convention, but he did it in civilian attire, right? He didn't do it as a general. He had resigned his commission, and that's so important.
Yep, exactly right. Of course, there was no such thing at the time of the convention as a political party. Those tended to evolve and to cast, I think, an even harsher or more important light, starker light, the importance of the apolitical nature of the uniformed military that, of course, has matured in those 2 centuries since.
That's right. Yeah. So in those 2 centuries since, you've had various political leaders and political parties trying to put on the role as the champion of the military and trying to, bring the military onto their side. But there's been some notable exceptions, which we can get into, but a notable pushback from the uniformed military to that. The military really believes this, as you say, they don't want to be involved in domestic national politics, right?
Well, that's exactly right, Andrew. I was fortunate as superintendent to have a young cadet named Jim Golby. He is now a lieutenant colonel, I think, about to retire from NATO headquarters and join a think tank in Austin, Texas. But there's a stable of these young officers. Jim Golby being one, Dan Maurer, a professor at West Point at the same time, who are awfully insightful on this issue of keeping the military out of politics and what it means if they were to even dip their toe into it. And what Golby has written about, he's an extensive, prolific author on this topic. The issue that worries Golby worried me when I was watching the live coverage of the Lafayette Square unfolding is what happens to that essential trust between the uniformed military and the American public if we were to get involved in domestic politics. And Jim Golby talks in this wonderful recent article about what could happen if this were to occur, if the military became politicized. And I just wanted to yell out to Jim from a distance, Jim, it did happen. It happened in the late 1960s when I was a lieutenant and a captain. And I came with my young wife to Washington, D.C. just after Dr. King was killed in the spring of 1968. And that was a horrible time when active duty troops were patrolling Washington, D.C. and Detroit and Los Angeles. And you can trace the loss of trust and confidence in the military during this period. And it took a decade and a half, if not 2 decades, into the 1980s before that was restored. I mean, we have an incredibly high level of trust and confidence now in our uniformed military. And I just shuddered when I looked at Lafayette Square and thought, oh my goodness, these comments about activating the either the National Guard under federal control, or even worse, bringing the 82nd Airborne or the 10th Mountain Division into the city of Washington, D.C. You know, I just said to myself and to the TV screen, please don't do this.
Yeah, yeah. You know, you're right, and I think it was a near run thing. You know, it does sound like, in reading the reports afterwards, certainly there was pressure on the military, on the leadership, General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, to bring them in. And you know, I think, you know, in some ways we're condemned to repeat the 1960s for decades here. You know, the same fights, the same battles, and everything like that. And it's really important that the military hasn't gotten involved in those cultural wars and those culture fights over the last decade or two, because, as you say, the U.S. military, among public institutions, is really the last public institution that pulls very strongly across partisan divides, across everything. You know, there's uniform respect among the American public for that, for the American military. And if it becomes seen as a tool of partisan politics, then that gets lost. And it's so important that that doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Of course, the Hatch Act does not apply to the uniformed military. It applies to us, to the uniformed military on active duty through a DoD directive. But as you look at the intro to the Hatch Act, it describes, you know, the rationale for that legislation in 1939. It's interesting, that long from the Constitutional Convention to ensure the idea that you don't involve the military and the executive branch in partisan politics. But it said the purpose of the Hatch Act is to avoid, and I just quote now, the pernicious effects of politics. And just to reflect on what you said, once the military gets into this, I couldn't imagine anything more pernicious than the undermining of the oath that we took and the undermining of the trust and confidence of the American people in the armed forces.
Yeah, pernicious is right. Pernicious is the exact way to put it. You know, and with already such a relatively small amount of you know, the United States population that serves and is in the military, you know, to lose that respect, and, you know, potentially lose recruits, and lose, you know, the idea that you could have people come in there, it could drastically affect the readiness and the ability of the future military to be able to meet its mission of protecting the United States from all enemies.
There's no question. I mean, when I was commissioned in '65, it was a draft army. Draft has gone away. We don't have that option anymore. It's an all volunteer force. But you're right. Once that trust and confidence is lost, one of the most immediate reflections of that on the end strength is the number of young men and women that want to volunteer to serve.
Yeah. So I was really interested in the fact that the pictures from Lafayette Square and the reporting that President Trump wanted to bring in the military really has almost activated the antibodies. You know, that there was a huge amount of pushback to that. So we had General Mattis, you know, obviously, who had been his Secretary of Defense, and it had kept his own counsel for a year and a half since resigning. He hadn't said word one about anything. And you had across the board, you had the 89 of you who signed a letter saying the military must never be used to violate constitutional rights. You had General Powell. You had, and then you know, even though General Milley was in that photo op, he then came out and made a very forceful statement that he should not have been there. So really interesting and important, I think, that you know, it kind of activated those antibodies and engendered some pushback.
It was and remains, in my mind, Andrew, an unbelievable 2.5 week period, because the people, many of those that you just outlined, Jim Madison, Marty Dempsey,
Yeah.
Colin Powell, those that I admire, who I worked for in the case of Powell and promoted me, made such strong statements about the importance of keeping the military out of domestic politics. And it's the picture. I mean, as we saw it unfold of General Milley walking there in uniform, I give him great credit for the fulsome apology that he made several days later at the National Defense University. And as you know, Secretary Esper himself walked back from the statements that he was making to the governors about trying to put the military to control the battle space,
Right.
In the city. And again, good for him for walking that back.
Yeah.
But Andrew, the important thing on all of this, and I keep reading the Mattis letter and saying, oh my goodness, I've never read anything like this from such an effective leader in talking about our commander-in-chief. But the important thing in all of this is that the guardrails held. Yeah. Guardrails held. As you hinted at in your opening here, there have been other times when those guardrails have been dented in American history, American military history. And as I saw Milley walk across the park there with the president, I know you're reading American Caesar there about Douglas MacArthur, but there's this wonderful story that was told some years ago by, at that point, some years ago, a young Army major who was advising the Army Chief of Staff. And this young Army major said in his memoirs years later, I told that son of a bitch not to go down there in uniform. And the young major was Dwight Eisenhower, and the SOE was Douglas MacArthur, who went down there in 1932 to confront the bonus army marchers. Yep. And George Will did a piece on this in the Washington Post a bit ago that described the MacArthur of that day, this bemedaled tunic World War I hero. What George Will didn't say in the article is that Douglas MacArthur deliberately disobeyed an order from President Hoover not to go into Anacostia and to destroy the bonus army camps. And of course he did. That night, Douglas MacArthur disobeyed the order. And it's one of the reasons why not too many months later, when FDR came into the presidency, FDR said that Douglas MacArthur is the second most dangerous man in America. The most dangerous being Huey Long. The assassin's bullet took care of him in terms of demagoguery. But MacArthur persisted. And his role in involving active duty flying officers, in his case, as early as 1944, on this issue of whether Roosevelt was going to run for a fourth term. And of course, in 1951, when the crisis with Harry Truman occurred, these were real dents to the guardrail. And MacArthur was hoping for some nomination by the Republicans in '52, and he gave this thud of a speech at the convention that year, and that was it for MacArthur in terms of his politics. But my goodness, Andrew, when you look back, I mean, I recall the Truman time, not clearly, but with some memory. And those were serious events. And when I saw the walk across the park, those of us that had some appreciation for that role that the uniformed military has played in American history just began to perspire and breathe deeply and say, oh, please, let's bring this to an end. Yeah.
And of course, Douglas MacArthur was he was a bona fide war hero, one of the great leaders. And, so he had the reason he was the most dangerous wasn't just because he wore the uniform. It was because he could, put the force of his character and his office behind this idea of pushing for, wouldn't it be better to have somebody, a strong man, to lead us than somebody who has to rely on democracy? And that's always the implied threat of the military, is that we need discipline, and look at what I've done with these military, and isn't that what the country needs? And it's always kind of something that is tempting to people.
Well, that's right, Andrew. But what's so unique about what we're going through. I mean, there are these historical parallels. But
Right.
I think as one looks back on the banging against the guardrails on civil-military relations, the MacArthur case in 51, 52, the
Yeah.
revolt of the admirals in 49,
Yeah.
Douglas MacArthur twice. I mean, even George McClellan, I
Yeah.
don't have a memory of this, but as you remember, I mean, he ran against Abraham Lincoln.
That's right.
And even as an active duty general, had clear political ambitions.
Mm-hmm.
Historians look back on, I think, each of these cases and say, in all these cases, the generals or the admirals were in the wrong.
Yeah.
The civilian authority that's enmeshed in the Constitution and in statute held, and it was correctly held.
Mm-hmm.
But what's so unique, Andrew, about what the Mattis letter and the statements of those that supported it suggest is that we have a basic issue about the ability and competence and even the loyalty of the sitting commander-in-chief. I mean, if you look at the Mattis letter, I mean, it cries out for saying, this is a person who is immature, divisive, an abuser of authority, bizarre behavior, and making a mockery of the Constitution. I can't ever remember in these other instances, from McClellan forward,
Exactly.
where the competence of the commander-in-chief was called into question. And that's what I think makes this particular episode that we're in right now so unique and in many respects so disturbing.
Yeah, and that you're right, of course, because the baseline idea is putting the military subservient to civil power. But if it's the civil power, the commander in chief, that's the one that's actually asking for it and wanting it. This would be as if Hoover had ordered MacArthur to go clear those camps and run the tanks through there and everything. And that's the big difference. And the more dangerous thing to this is that it is the commander-in-chief trying to enlist the military in his plans, in his sort of ideas.
Yep. That's right. That's, I just shake my head. And when I think all of us watched or read these really emotion-laden letters and statements, from Mike Mullen in the Air Force and Marty Dempsey in the Army, and Colin Powell was on, a week or so ago with Jake Tapper, and you could just see the anguish in this wonderful man's voice about what was underway now in this tension that we're talking about. I'm just thankful that we have those people still around. And I think as a result, maybe this is more triumph of wish and prayer and hope over reality, but I think it really did force the president to step back. Just to see this incredible wealth of professionalism come forth and say what they did at the time that they did.
Yeah. I heard somebody say about the president, about Trump, he continues to shock, but maybe he doesn't surprise, because anybody who's been watching him since the campaign and throughout his term here is that, of course, he revels in his support from his generals and such like that. And he revels in this idea of being a champion of the military. And of course, he would ask them to do this if he felt like he was in danger. And so it's shocking, of course, but not a surprise. And so I hope, here as we run up towards, the inevitable politicization of our society over the next several months of a presidential election, we're going to have it. Everybody gets involved in it. It's, it's the great American every 4 year, everybody goes crazy, but that's okay. That's what we're about. But so long as we keep the guardrails, as you say, and keep the military separate from that.
Right. Well, I think the lessons learned from this are now being written into the programs of instruction, the POIs, in the various military schools, certainly at West Point and in the pre-commissioning courses. But we're going to have. I don't want to be too downer on this, but we're going to have, I think, a challenge here come this fall in terms of election. I think that may well be the next test here. It's going to be close. However it turns out, it's going to be probably resolved by some court decisions and all. And one just hopes that the memory of the oath that the officers and the non-commissioned officers took in terms of where those loyalties lie will stay vibrant in their mind as as months wear on.
Yeah. Well, General Christman, we always like to end our podcast here with the idea that ASP doesn't just react to what's in the headlines today, but we think about what's going to be in the headlines in the future. So what's a headline that we can hope for and work towards in 5 years or so about this topic? What's something new that we should be pushing towards or working for to get there?
On the issue
of civil military affairs.
The relations. Yeah, I think arguably broadening the base in which the military ranks are populated. I think that can, for a professional military force, it's been this way now since the early 70s. A professional military force relies so much upon willing volunteers who are confident they'll be both well taken care of while they're in uniform and serving a noble cause. And we need to make certain that one of the sins of other professional forces is that the recruiting base and the veteran base doesn't become so narrow.
You're right.
They're separated from the demos, from the population, from the democracy that we are constitutionally pledged to serve. So, I think I have no fear that in the months and years ahead that we won't meet recruiting targets. I mean, we're not going to be, absent a major conflict, expanding geometrically in the number of soldiers, airmen, sailors, Marines that we need. But what we do need to make sure is that we have a sufficient representation of the diversity of this nation through all elements of this tremendous society that we are pledged to serve. And I think if I were to sort of put as number one issue right now, it's not so much, do we have the right doctrine or are we getting rid of legacy weapon systems, but what are we doing to ensure that the recruiting base and those in the armed forces reflect this great democracy that we're so privileged and proud to serve? Right.
That's a great point, and a great way to wrap it into the protest movements and everything that we're seeing today is that's right. Out of many, one, right? E pluribus unum. Out of this diverse nation, we kind of all come together, and you're right. We shouldn't have a warrior class or something like that serves separate from the society, but the military is a part of society.
That was one of the reasons, evidently, why Thomas Jefferson was so opposed to even the thought of a military academy at the end of the 18th century. But we had too many other commitments to deal with, and we were relying too much upon folks like von Steuben and Kosciuszko and the Marquis de Lafayette. We needed our own academy.
That's right.
His vision was that this academy would be grounded in the broad democracy that he was so proud to lead in 1802.
Well, General Dan Christman, this was a great conversation, really interesting, and I learned a lot. Thank you for being with us, and thanks for your support to ASP over the years.
It's a real honor. ASP is a wonderful organization, and thanks for your leadership, Andrew. Thanks.